He came home from war with scars no one could see, and a silence that followed him into every room. Ethan worked long days taking whatever labor he could find, hauling lumber, clearing snow, repairing broken porches, then returned each night to a house that felt too big for one man. The only soul who never left his side was an aging German shepherd named Shadow. Now Shadow's steps were slower, his breathing heavier, and Ethan had started walking a little more slowly too, not because he was tired, but because he didn't want to leave his best friend behind. Years ago, that same dog had dragged him away from death, but this time, there would be no battlefield, no rescue team, just one quiet night and a goodbye Ethan wasn't ready to face.
Shadow.
If you've ever loved a dog who changed your life, stay with me. And before we begin, if you believe in the love and loyalty of dogs, subscribe to the channel to hear more stories like this. A pale autumn light drifted through the thinning trees at the edge of Brookidge. The air cool, but not yet cruel, carrying the faint scent of damp leaves and wood smoke from distant chimneys. The sky hung low in a washed-out gray, as if the day itself were undecided whether to brighten or surrender to rain. Ethan Cole walked slowly along the gravel road that curved past the outskirts of town, his boots pressing small, deliberate prints into the dust. At 46, he still carried the build of a soldier. Broad shoulders, strong arms, a straight back that refused to bend even after years of manual labor. But time had marked him in quieter ways. Fine lines framed his steady hazel eyes. Faint silver threaded through his dark brown hair at the temples. A trimmed beard shaded his jaw, neat but never styled for attention. He wore a green and black plaid shirt over a plain gray undershirt, black jeans worn soft at the knees, and low brown leather shoes scuffed from work. He did not dress to impress anyone. He dressed to endure. Shadow moved beside him. The German shepherd had once carried himself like a blade, sharp, alert, unstoppable. Now his black and tan coat had faded slightly around the muzzle, silver hairs spreading across his face like frost. His ears still stood tall, but they twitched slower than before. His amber-brown eyes, once fierce and scanning, had grown deeper, gentler, lined with the patience of age. When he walked, there was a stiffness in his back legs, a faint tremor in his hips. His breathing came heavier than it used to, especially on inclines. Yet every morning, without fail, he rose when Ethan did. Every afternoon, he followed. Ethan noticed everything. He shortened his stride when Shadow lagged. He pretended to stop and examine a loose mailbox or a cracked fence post so the dog could catch up without shame. He never pulled ahead. He never allowed the space between them to widen. He also never spoke about what was coming. In town, people knew Ethan, though few could claim they knew him well. He took whatever work was offered, stacking lumber behind the hardware store, repairing porch steps, hauling discarded appliances from backyards. The owner of Miller's Hardware, an older man named Tom Miller with a round belly and a permanent grease stain on his collar, often said Ethan worked harder than boys half his age. Tom was broad-faced and red-cheeked, his thinning white hair combed carefully across his scalp. He liked to talk while he worked, filling silence with stories of fishing trips and grandchildren. Ethan listened politely, but rarely offered more than a nod or a short answer. It was not rudeness. It was distance. There had been a time when Ethan laughed more easily, a time when his voice carried warmth instead of weight. That time had ended overseas. He never told the full story. Most in Brookidge only knew he had served, that he came back quieter than he left, that he rented a small, aging house at the edge of town where the forest began. They saw the flag folded in a triangular case on his shelf when they stepped inside to pay him. They saw the framed photograph of a younger Ethan in uniform beside a younger Shadow, both of them alert and strong. They did not ask questions. Shadow had once been introduced to the town as a working military dog. Children used to stare at him in awe when Ethan first returned, drawn to the dog's commanding posture and disciplined gaze. Now they saw only an old dog who walked slowly beside a quiet man. That afternoon, as Ethan finished repairing loose planks on Mrs. Carter's porch, Shadow lay nearby in a patch of filtered sunlight. Mrs. Carter, a thin widow in her late 60s with neatly pinned silver hair and soft blue eyes, watched the dog from her rocking chair. She had the gentle, careful movements of someone who had learned to live alone. "He's getting older," she said quietly, not unkindly. Ethan's hands paused mid-hammer. He did not look at her. "We both are." Mrs. Carter smiled faintly but did not press further. She had lost her husband years ago. She recognized that tone. Some grief was spoken. Some was guarded like a last possession. When the job was done, Ethan collected his modest pay, nodded in thanks, and headed back toward the road. Shadow rose slowly, shaking once before falling into step. Halfway home, the dog stumbled briefly on uneven gravel. It was small, barely noticeable to anyone else, but Ethan saw it. He bent instantly, one hand steady on Shadow's flank, his thumb brushing the coarse fur. "Easy," he murmured, his voice low and steady. Shadow's eyes lifted to meet his. There was no panic in them, only trust. That trust cut deeper than fear ever could. At home, the house felt quieter than the forest outside. The structure was modest, paint peeling slightly at the edges. Porch railing repaired more times than replaced. Inside, everything was orderly. A narrow couch, a wooden table with 2 chairs, though only one was used, a shelf with a few worn books, and that framed photograph. Ethan removed his shoes by the door. Shadow lowered himself onto the rug with a soft groan that Ethan pretended not to hear. As evening approached, clouds thickened overhead. The wind shifted. Rain began gently, tapping against the windows before settling into a steady rhythm. Ethan stood by the doorway for a long moment, watching droplets slide down the glass. Storms used to mean something different. They used to echo. Shadow struggled to stand and walked to Ethan's side anyway. "You don't have to," Ethan whispered. The dog leaned against his leg. The rain intensified. Thunder rolled faintly in the distance. Ethan sank down beside Shadow on the wooden floor, his back resting against the wall. He placed one hand slowly on the dog's head, fingers threading into familiar fur. The texture was thinner now, softer. He felt the warmth beneath his palm. He focused on it as if memorizing it. He had faced gunfire without shaking. He had crossed fields that might explode beneath his feet. He had carried men heavier than himself through smoke and chaos. But this quiet decline, this slow unraveling of the one being who had never left him, this frightened him in a way war never had. Shadow's breathing slowed as he settled. Outside, rain blurred the world into gray streaks. Inside, silence pressed close. Ethan closed his eyes. The sound of rain shifted in his memory. It became something else. distant shouting, the metallic click of equipment, the tension before movement. His hand tightened unconsciously against Shadow's fur. And just like that, the past began to rise. The rain outside blurred into another sound entirely. It became the distant hum of engines, the metallic rattle of equipment being unloaded at dawn, the faint tension that lived in the air before a patrol moved out. Ethan did not open his eyes in the present. Instead, he felt the weight of his gear on his shoulders again, the heat pressing down on the back of his neck, the taste of dust and iron lingering at the edge of his tongue. He was 28 then, leaner, sharper, his jaw clean-shaven, his eyes harder. The green and black plaid shirt was replaced by desert camouflage, but the posture was the same, straight, controlled, disciplined. Shadow was young, too. His coat gleamed under the harsh morning sun, black along the saddle and rich tan on his legs and face, muscles coiled beneath sleek fur, ears erect and alert, eyes burning with intelligence. He moved not as a pet, but as a partner, trained for detection, trained for war, trained to trust and to decide. The mission that morning had been a route clearance along a narrow stretch of dirt road leading toward a village long abandoned. Intelligence reports suggested improvised explosive devices scattered along the approach. The unit was small, deliberate. Leading them was Sergeant Marcus Hale, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 30s with closely cropped blonde hair and a square jaw that looked carved from stone. Marcus carried himself with quiet authority. He spoke little, but expected much. A scar ran faintly along his left cheek, a souvenir from an earlier deployment, and it had shaped him into a leader who calculated every step twice before taking it. To his men, he was steady ground in unstable places. Ethan walked third in formation, Shadow slightly ahead but tethered loosely, trained to sweep and signal. Corporal Luis Ramirez followed behind, a compact, dark-haired man with warm brown eyes and a trimmed mustache that curled slightly at the edges when he smiled. Ramirez had a way of lightening tension with humor, but even he was silent that morning. The air felt wrong, too still, too watchful. Shadow paused. It was subtle at first. His head tilted, his nose twitched. Then his body stiffened entirely, tail rigid, ears angled forward. Ethan felt the shift instantly through the line. Years of training taught him to read that tension like a language. He raised a hand, fist closed. The unit froze. "Hold," Marcus whispered from ahead. Shadow took one step forward and then abruptly moved sideways, blocking Ethan's path with his body. It was not aggression. It was insistence. Ethan frowned slightly, scanning the ground. The dirt looked undisturbed. No obvious wires, no unnatural mounds. But Shadow's focus narrowed on a patch barely 3 feet ahead. Ethan crouched slowly, heart rate steady but rising. "Easy," he murmured, though he knew Shadow did not need calming. The dog's eyes never left the spot. Marcus approached carefully from the side. "What do you see?" he asked. "Nothing," Ethan answered. That word felt heavier than it should have. The explosion came without warning. It detonated 10 feet ahead of them, not where Shadow had indicated, but slightly beyond. The blast tore upward in a violent plume of dust and shrapnel, the shock wave slamming into the unit. Ethan's ears rang instantly. He dropped to one knee, vision blurred by debris. Ramirez cursed behind him. Marcus barked orders, voice cutting through chaos. Before Ethan could fully reorient, there was a second metallic click, small, almost delicate compared to the first roar. The sound came from directly beneath where Ethan had been about to step. Shadow reacted before thought could form. He lunged. His teeth caught Ethan's sleeve and yanked backward with a force so sudden that Ethan lost balance. The second explosion erupted where his boot would have landed. The blast hurled both man and dog sideways. Ethan felt himself lifted off the ground, the world tilting violently before slamming down. Air left his lungs in a brutal rush. Pain streaked across his ribs. Dust swallowed the sky. For a moment, there was nothing but ringing. Then coughing, shouting. The sharp command of Marcus rallying the team. Ethan tried to push up, but his arm trembled. He turned his head. Shadow lay a few feet away, breathing hard but alive. Dirt coated his fur. One ear bled slightly at the tip. His chest rose and fell rapidly, eyes blinking against the dust. Ethan crawled toward him without hesitation. "Shadow," he rasped, voice hoarse. The dog's gaze locked onto him immediately. Recognition. Focus. No fear. Ramirez reached them first, grabbing Ethan under the arm. "You're lucky," he said breathlessly, though his usual humor was absent. "Another inch and you'd be gone." Marcus knelt beside Shadow, assessing quickly. "He pulled you?" the sergeant said, tone steady but edged with something close to awe. Ethan nodded faintly. He knew it. He had felt the yank, the split-second intervention. He looked at the crater where he would have stepped. The earth was torn open like a wound. They secured the area after that, moving with even greater caution. The mission continued because it had to, but something had shifted in Ethan's understanding. This was not simply a trained animal performing commands. This was judgment. This was choice. Shadow had not waited for confirmation. He had acted. Back at base later that day, a medic named Lieutenant Carla Benson examined both man and dog. Carla was in her early 30s, tall and athletic, with tightly braided dark hair and a calm, analytical expression. She had a faint crease between her brows that appeared whenever she focused, giving her a look of constant concern even when she was composed. "You'll bruise," she told Ethan, wrapping his ribs. "But nothing broken." She turned to Shadow next, her movements gentler. "And you," she murmured softly, cleaning the small cut on his ear. "You're something else." Ethan sat upright on the edge of the cot, watching every motion. He did not relax until Shadow's tail thumped once against the metal frame. That night, long after lights out, Ethan lay awake in his bunk. Across the room, Shadow rested on a mat, breathing steady again. The image replayed in Ethan's mind. The block, the yank, the blast. He had faced danger before. He had trusted training, equipment, orders, but this had been different. This had been a life balanced on instinct. Marcus approached quietly, boots soft against the floor. "You realize," he said in a low voice, "that dog saved you today." Ethan swallowed. "I know." Marcus nodded once. Some men freeze in that moment. He didn't. There was no embellishment in the statement, no dramatic tone, just truth. Ethan turned his head slightly, looking at Shadow's silhouette in the dim light. The dog shifted in sleep, paws twitching faintly, as if running in some unseen field. In that stillness, Ethan understood something he had not allowed himself to feel before. Gratitude, yes, but deeper than that. Dependence. Trust not built on command, but on shared survival. The next morning, as they prepared for another patrol, Ethan knelt before Shadow and pressed his forehead briefly against the dog's. It was not a ritual taught in training manuals. It was something personal, unspoken. Shadow's ears flicked, and he held still, steady as ever. That was the first time Ethan knew with absolute certainty that his life did not belong to him alone. Back in the present, rain continued to fall outside the small house in Brookidge. Ethan's hand remained resting on the aging dog's head. The memory faded slowly, like dust settling after an explosion. Shadow shifted slightly beneath his palm, older now, slower, but the same presence remained. The same unwavering loyalty. The same readiness that once pulled a man away from death without hesitation. Ethan opened his eyes. He did not say thank you. He never had to. The rain in the present deepened, but in Ethan's memory it turned harsher, colder, relentless against metal and sandbags. Night had fallen fast that day overseas, the sky collapsing into thick clouds that swallowed the moon. Water pooled in shallow trenches, soaking boots and seeping into fabric. The air smelled of wet earth and cordite. Ethan remembered how the rain flattened sound, and yet somehow made every distant crack of gunfire feel closer. Shadow had been younger then, muscles tight beneath rain-darkened fur, eyes cutting through the darkness with a precision Ethan trusted more than his own sight. The patrol that night had not been meant to escalate. It was a short movement between temporary positions along a ridge overlooking a dry valley that now churned into mud. Sergeant Marcus Hale led as usual, posture rigid even in exhaustion. Weeks of constant tension had etched deeper lines around his mouth. He had lost 2 men on earlier missions, and it had hardened him, not into cruelty, but into a constant state of vigilance. Corporal Luis Ramirez walked beside Ethan this time, rifle held close, lips pressed thin. The easy humor he usually carried had been eroded by too many near misses. Even Lieutenant Carla Benson had joined the forward team temporarily to assist with casualty transport if needed, her braids soaked through, jaw clenched in focus. The ambush came without warning. Gunfire erupted from the slope above, muzzle flashes slicing through the rain like brief, violent stars. Ethan dropped instantly, pulling Shadow down beside him. Marcus barked orders, voice sharp and controlled, directing suppressive fire. Ramirez returned shots with steady rhythm, but the enemy position was higher, concealed by rock and shadow. The ground trembled as small-caliber rounds struck dirt and metal. Ethan moved to flank left, Shadow close, scanning. Then a sudden concussive blast tore through the lower ridge. It was not as large as the earlier minefield explosion, but close enough. The force knocked Ethan backward. Something hot and searing ripped across his thigh. He hit the ground hard, breath punched from his chest. His rifle skidded away. For a moment he could not feel his leg. Shadow was immediately at his side. The dog nudged him hard with his nose, whining low but controlled. Ethan tried to sit up, pain exploding through his body. His right thigh burned fiercely, blood mixed with rain, turning mud dark and slick beneath him. He attempted to stand and failed. His vision flickered at the edges. "Fall back!" Marcus shouted from somewhere ahead. "Fall back to cover!" Ramirez hesitated near Ethan's position, eyes wide. "He's hit!" he yelled. Marcus assessed in a split second. More gunfire cracked overhead. The position was untenable. "Move," he ordered. "We regroup and come back." Ramirez's face twisted in conflict. He grabbed Ethan's shoulder. "Hold on," he said urgently, but Marcus's command overrode instinct. Ramirez withdrew, firing as he moved, boots splashing through mud. Ethan tried to respond, but his voice failed him. The world narrowed. Rain fell harder, masking footsteps, masking everything. He could not hear the team retreat clearly anymore. Only the pounding of his own pulse and the steady sound of Shadow's breathing close to his face. "Go," Ethan whispered hoarsely, though he did not know if the word formed fully. Shadow did not move. The dog pressed against Ethan's chest, then shifted to nudge his jaw upward, licking rain and blood from his cheek. Ethan's eyes fluttered. Darkness crept inward. He felt cold despite the humid air. Minutes passed, or seconds. Time fractured. Shadow began to bark. Not frantic, not wild, sharp, purposeful bursts that cut through the rain. He nudged Ethan again, pawing at his shoulder. When there was no response, the dog made a decision. He ran. Through mud and darkness, through distant gunfire, he followed the scent trail of the retreating unit. He caught up quickly. Marcus turned at the sound of barking cutting through the storm. Shadow darted in front of him, blocking his path, then turned and ran a few yards back toward Ethan's position, before returning again, barking louder. Marcus understood instantly. Ramirez did not hesitate this time. "He's still alive," he said, voice raw. Marcus's jaw tightened. The calculation ended. "We go back." They moved fast, tighter formation, covering angles. Shadow sprinted ahead, guiding them directly to where Ethan lay half submerged in muddy water. Carla dropped beside him immediately, hands firm and efficient. "He's losing blood," she said, voice steady but urgent. Her fingers worked to apply a tourniquet above the wound. "Stay with me, Ethan. Look at me." Ethan's eyes opened faintly. He did not see Carla clearly. He saw Shadow's silhouette against lightning flashes. Ramirez provided cover while Marcus scanned for renewed threat. The firefight had shifted. The enemy likely assumed them gone. Rain continued to mask sound, offering brief mercy. Carla's hands were swift and precise despite the cold. She injected pain control, reinforced bandaging, stabilized him enough to move. "We have minutes," she said quietly. Shadow remained pressed against Ethan's side as they lifted him onto an improvised stretcher. The dog did not bark now. He did not panic. He walked in perfect alignment as they retreated again, eyes constantly scanning the darkness. Back at the temporary base, floodlights cut harsh white beams through rain. Ethan was transferred to a more stable position. Blood loss had been severe, his pulse weak. Carla worked with relentless concentration, assisted by another medic newly assigned to the unit, Specialist Jordan Pike, a tall, narrow-faced man with sandy hair and nervous hands that trembled slightly until given clear direction. Jordan had been fresh to deployment, the reality of field trauma still shaping his composure. That night, under pressure, something hardened inside him. He followed Carla's commands without hesitation. Ethan drifted in and out of awareness. At one point, he heard Marcus speaking low near his ear. "You're not done?" the sergeant said. "You hear me? You're not done." But the voice that anchored him most was not human. Shadow lay directly beneath the cot once Ethan was stabilized. Regulations would have required the dog to be kenneled temporarily, but Marcus overrode that without comment. Shadow's presence was not comfort alone. It was grounding. Every time Ethan's breathing faltered, the dog shifted, whining softly, as if pulling him back by sound alone. Hours later, as rain eased and dawn crept pale over the horizon, Ethan's condition stabilized enough for evacuation. He would survive, though the wound would leave a scar that ached in cold weather for years. Before he was loaded for transport, he opened his eyes fully for the first time since the blast. The first thing he saw was Shadow's face inches from his own. Wet fur. Amber eyes unwavering. Carla stood nearby, exhaustion lining her features but relief softening her expression. "He found us," she said quietly, nodding toward the dog. "He wouldn't stop until we followed." Marcus added nothing. He simply met Ethan's gaze and gave one firm nod. The message was clear. Shadow had not only stayed, he had chosen action. He had crossed open ground under fire to bring life back where it was fading. Years later, sitting on the wooden floor of his quiet house in Brookidge, Ethan's fingers tightened slightly in Shadow's aging fur as that memory settled fully. The scar on his thigh throbbed faintly with the change in weather. He remembered the cold of that night, the weight of darkness, the sense of being left behind. And he remembered the sound of barking cutting through rain. Shadow shifted beside him in the present, older now, breathing heavier. But the loyalty had never thinned. Not then. Not now. In that storm overseas, when everything else had retreated, Shadow had run toward life instead of away from danger. He had not simply stayed. He had called Ethan back from the edge. The rain eased into a fine mist by the time Ethan's memories loosened their grip on him. In the present, the house at the edge of Brookidge felt smaller than usual, as if the walls leaned inward to listen. Shadow lay beside him, older now, muzzle silvered, breath slow and heavy. The storm had awakened more than sound. It had drawn loose threads of the past into something clearer, sharper. But there were parts Ethan still did not fully know. The answer came years earlier, though he did not recognize its weight at first. It had been late spring in Brookidge, the trees bright with new leaves, sunlight cutting clean lines across the sidewalks. Ethan had been unloading lumber behind Miller's Hardware when a truck he did not recognize pulled into the gravel lot. It was an older model pickup, dark blue with chipped paint and a dented rear bumper. The engine shut off slowly, as if tired. A tall man stepped out, straightening with visible stiffness before closing the door. It took Ethan a moment to place him. Sergeant Marcus Hale no longer wore camouflage. He wore faded jeans, boots worn down at the heel, and a plain brown jacket over a flannel shirt. His blonde hair had grown longer and streaked faintly with gray. The scar on his cheek was still there, though softened by time. His shoulders remained broad, but there was a heaviness in the way he carried them, as if years had settled there permanently. He had the same square jaw, the same controlled expression, but something gentler edged his gaze now. Retirement had not erased command from him. It had simply reshaped it. Ethan stood slowly. Shadow, younger then but already past his prime, rose from beneath the shade of the lumber stack. His ears perked, his body stilled. Marcus stepped forward, hands resting loosely at his sides. "Cole," he said simply. Ethan nodded. "Hale." There was no embrace, no dramatic reunion, just recognition carved from shared survival. They stood in silence for a few seconds before Tom Miller shuffled out from the store's back door, wiping his hands on a rag. Tom squinted toward the stranger. "Friend of yours?" he asked, voice casual but curious. Marcus gave a brief nod. something like that. Tom, sensing depth he did not belong in, retreated politely. Later that afternoon, Ethan and Marcus sat on the small porch outside Ethan's house. Shadow lay between them, head resting on his paws, amber eyes shifting calmly from one man to the other. The forest beyond the yard hummed quietly with insects and distant birds. For a long time, they spoke of ordinary things, where life had taken them, which names from the unit still echoed in memory, who had married, who had drifted away. Marcus now worked security at a shipping yard 2 towns over. He had married briefly after returning home, but the marriage had not lasted. I was still over there, he admitted, tapping his temple. Hard to build something when you never really come back. Ethan understood without elaboration. It was not until the sun dipped lower and the shadows stretched long that Marcus leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes settling on Shadow. I've thought about that night, he said quietly. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Which one? The ridge. Silence settled again, heavier this time. Marcus exhaled slowly. You know he didn't just find us once. Ethan frowned faintly. He ran to you, brought you back. Marcus shook his head. No, he ran to us 3 times. Ethan turned fully toward him. Marcus continued, voice steady but edged with something close to reverence. The first time, we thought he'd gotten separated. He burst through the brush, barking like hell. Ramirez wanted to go back immediately. I hesitated. He paused, not out of shame but honesty. We were exposed. Could have lost more men. Then he ran back toward your position. We followed about halfway. Gunfire flared again. We pulled back. Shadow shifted slightly, ears flicking at the tone. Marcus swallowed once before continuing. He came back again, soaked, covered in mud, barking louder. He grabbed Ramirez's sleeve with his teeth and pulled. That dog was frantic but focused. He wasn't panicking. He was commanding. Ethan's chest tightened. Marcus's voice dropped lower. The third time, he didn't bark. He just stood in front of me and stared. I've never seen an animal look at me like that. It wasn't fear. It wasn't confusion. It was demand. Like he was saying, "You move now." Marcus leaned back slightly, eyes distant. That's when I knew you were still breathing. He wouldn't have stopped otherwise. Ethan stared at Shadow. The dog's muzzle was not yet fully gray in that moment of memory, but the loyalty in his gaze was unchanged. He went back to you every time, Marcus added. After each run, he checked you, then came for us again. By the time we reached you for good, he was shaking, exhausted, but he stayed standing until you were lifted. Ethan's throat felt dry. He had known Shadow saved him. He had felt the pull, heard the bark. But he had never understood the repetition, the insistence, the refusal to accept retreat. Marcus stood slowly. I don't think I ever told you the whole thing. Figured you had enough weight already. Ethan nodded once, unable to speak immediately. Before leaving, Marcus knelt awkwardly and placed a hand briefly on Shadow's neck. You outranked all of us that night, he murmured. Shadow blinked, calm as ever. After Marcus drove away, Ethan remained seated on the porch long after dusk settled. The forest darkened around him. Shadow leaned lightly against his leg, unaware of the shift occurring inside the man beside him. For years, Ethan had carried guilt like a private burden. He believed his survival came down to chance, to luck, to the randomness of war. He had also believed that when the unit retreated, he had simply been fortunate they returned in time. Now he understood something different. It had not been luck. It had been choice, and not his own. In the present, the rain had nearly stopped. A faint drip fell from the edge of the roof outside. Ethan remained seated on the floor, hand resting on Shadow's aging head. The dog's breathing was slower than it had once been. There was stiffness in his joints when he shifted. The silver in his muzzle had spread fully. Ethan studied him carefully, as if seeing layers of time superimposed over one another. The young, powerful, working dog, the mud-soaked figure sprinting through gunfire, the exhausted guardian refusing to collapse, and now this older companion who struggled to rise but still did. He had always known Shadow was loyal, but loyalty had a depth he had never measured correctly. It was not just obedience, it was persistence. It was returning again and again until life answered. Ethan's fingers moved gently through the thinning fur. "I didn't know," he whispered softly, more to himself than to the dog. Shadow lifted his eyes briefly, meeting Ethan's gaze. There was no need for explanation in them. For the first time, Ethan understood that what Shadow had done was greater than a single heroic act. It had been relentless devotion, repeated under fire, sustained beyond exhaustion. Outside, the last of the rain ceased entirely. Inside the small house at the edge of town, Ethan looked at the aging German shepherd beside him and felt something shift from guilt into gratitude. What Shadow had done that night had been larger than he ever realized. And now, as time slowed the dog's steps and weakened his breath, Ethan saw clearly that the life he had been given back had never been accidental. It had been earned for him. Morning arrived in Brookidge washed clean after the storm, sunlight sliding across wet rooftops and dripping leaves. The air held that sharp clarity that follows heavy rain, as if the town had been rinsed overnight. Ethan stood on his small porch in his green and black plaid shirt, sleeves rolled halfway up his forearms, black jeans darkened slightly at the cuffs from damp grass. He had not slept much. Shadow lay near the steps, chin resting on his paws, breathing steady but slow. The conversation with Marcus from years ago lingered inside Ethan like a stone that had finally shifted but not yet settled. The abandoned observation station sat miles beyond town, carved into a rocky ridge overlooking a deep valley. It had once been used for training exercises when the military still rotated units through nearby terrain. After funding shifted and the program closed, the structure was left behind. Concrete walls stained by weather, metal railings rusted, windows shattered by time and careless hands. Ethan had not gone near it since returning home. He told himself there was no reason to, but the truth was simpler. The ridge reminded him too much of another one, of mud, of gunfire, of the night he could not reach someone in time. That someone had been Private Nolan Brooks. Nolan had been 22, tall and lean with dark curls that never quite stayed flat under his helmet. He had a narrow face, sharp cheekbones, and eyes that carried a restless curiosity about everything. He talked about becoming a mechanic after deployment, about buying an old truck and rebuilding it from scratch. He had grown up in a small town much like Brookidge and missed fishing with his father more than he admitted. Ethan had been assigned as his immediate support on several missions. Not officially a mentor, but close enough that Nolan looked to him for cues. The night Nolan fell, everything had moved too fast. Smoke, collapse, a structure giving way. Ethan had tried to reach him. The ground had shifted. Orders had forced retreat. The memory never fully settled into clarity. It existed as fragments, and in those fragments, Ethan always arrived too late. He had avoided the ridge ever since. Around mid-morning, the distant wail of a siren cut through the quiet. Ethan stiffened instinctively before realizing it was not an emergency vehicle racing past his house, but stopping somewhere closer to the main road. He stepped off the porch and walked toward the edge of his yard. A police SUV sat near the intersection down the hill. Beside it stood Sheriff Daniel Reeves, a broad-chested man in his early 40s with a thick brown beard trimmed neatly along his jawline. Daniel's posture was upright but never aggressive. He carried authority with a measured calm. His uniform fit snugly over a frame built from years of farm labor before he entered law enforcement. He had grown up in Brookidge and returned after academy training because he believed small towns deserved steady hands. Beside him stood a woman Ethan did not immediately recognize. She was tall and slender, with ash-blonde hair pulled into a loose ponytail that had begun to fray at the edges from anxious fingers running through it. Her face was pale, almost translucent, freckles faint across her nose. She wore jeans and a light jacket, though the day had warmed. Her hands trembled as she spoke. Sheriff Reeves noticed Ethan watching and raised a hand. Ethan approached slowly, Shadow following despite the stiffness in his gait. "This is Laura Bennett," Daniel said gently. "Her son, Caleb, didn't come home last night." Laura turned toward Ethan, eyes rimmed red but dry now, as if she had already cried beyond tears. "He's 9, she said, voice thin but steady. Dark hair, blue hoodie, small for his age. He likes to explore." Her lips pressed together briefly. "He told me he was going to look at the old lookout on the ridge. I thought he meant during the day." The words settled heavily. Ethan felt something tighten inside his chest. "The observation station?" he asked quietly. Daniel nodded. "We've searched near the trailhead, found footprints headed up. Storm rolled in hard after dark. It's slick up there." Laura's gaze dropped to Shadow. "He loves dogs," she said faintly. "Caleb would follow one anywhere." Ethan knelt instinctively beside Shadow, resting a hand along the dog's back. The old German shepherd's ears flicked at the tone in Laura's voice. He lifted his head slowly, studying her, then the sheriff, then Ethan. "I'll go," Ethan said before thinking further. Daniel hesitated. "It's unstable terrain. We've got deputies coming from the next county. You'll lose time waiting," Ethan replied evenly. He did not sound heroic. He sounded certain. Laura stepped forward slightly. "Please," she whispered. Shadow rose fully now, joints protesting but determination overriding pain. He took 2 slow steps toward the direction of the ridge road and then glanced back at Ethan, eyes alert in a way they had not been earlier that morning. Daniel studied the pair for a moment. He knew Ethan's background. Everyone did, even if they did not discuss it openly. "All right," he said finally. "We go together? I'll radio updates." The climb began just before noon. The path wound upward through wet underbrush, roots exposed and slick from the night's rain. Ethan moved carefully, testing each step. Shadow stayed close but slightly ahead when terrain allowed, nose working despite the damp air that muted scent. Daniel followed, scanning with trained caution. Laura insisted on coming as far as the lower bend, despite Daniel's attempts to keep her back. She was not fragile, though her fear showed in the tightness of her shoulders. She had the look of someone who had learned to manage life alone. A thin silver ring on her finger suggested divorce or loss. There was resolve beneath the fear. Halfway up, Ethan's scar began to ache sharply. The old injury pulsed in rhythm with the climb. He ignored it. The observation station came into view. Concrete walls streaked dark from rain. Metal door hanging crooked on its hinge. Wind moved faintly through broken windows, creating a low whistle that carried across the valley. Shadow froze. His head lifted high, nostrils flaring. He shifted direction slightly, pulling toward a narrow side path that veered off from the main trail. Ethan followed the line of the leash loosely, heart beginning to pound in a way unrelated to exertion. Daniel called into his radio, giving their position. Shadow moved faster now, surprising for his age. He descended a short incline toward a cluster of jagged rocks partially hidden by brush. Then he barked, sharp, urgent. Ethan's breath caught. He pushed through the brush and saw it. A small figure wedged between two boulders where the ground had partially collapsed. A boy in a blue hoodie, face pale, one arm trapped awkwardly beneath his body. His dark hair clung to his forehead with dried rain. His eyes were open but unfocused. "Caleb," Ethan said softly. The boy stirred faintly at the sound. Daniel moved quickly to assess stability. "Careful," he warned. "Loose rock above." Shadow positioned himself near Caleb's head, lowering his body slowly, tail still. He did not bark again. He watched. Ethan crouched, ignoring the protest in his leg, and spoke gently. "You're going to be okay." His voice carried a steadiness forged years earlier under fire. Caleb blinked. "Mom?" he whispered weakly. "She's waiting," Ethan replied. Working carefully, Ethan and Daniel shifted stones, creating space. It took long minutes. The rocks scraped against skin and fabric. Ethan's muscles strained. His scar burned fiercely. But eventually, Caleb was freed enough for Daniel to pull him clear. The boy cried out once in pain before sagging against Ethan's chest. Shadow leaned forward and pressed his nose lightly against Caleb's cheek, as if confirming breath. Down below, Laura's voice broke across the hillside as she heard Daniel call out confirmation over the radio. The sound carried relief and disbelief intertwined. As they began the careful descent with Caleb supported between them, Ethan glanced once toward the observation station silhouetted against the sky. The ridge no longer felt like something to avoid. Shadow walked beside him, older, slower, but unwavering. Ethan had returned to the place he once refused to face, and this time he had not been too late. The wind shifted sharply as they reached the lower bend of the ridge, carrying the scent of wet stone and distant pine. Though the rain had eased earlier, dark clouds gathered again over the valley, thick and heavy with the promise of another downpour. Sheriff Daniel Reeves signaled for Laura to stay near the trailhead with Deputy Mark Ellis, a younger officer who had just arrived from the neighboring county. Mark was in his late 20s, lean and slightly taller than Daniel, with close-cropped black hair and a narrow face that still held traces of youthful uncertainty. His movements were quick, but occasionally hesitant, the kind that came from someone still learning how to balance instinct with training. He nodded firmly when given instructions, eager to prove himself useful. Caleb had been found, but his condition remained fragile. A paramedic unit was en route, climbing the lower path with equipment. Yet before Ethan and Daniel could begin a careful descent, Caleb stirred faintly in Ethan's arms and whispered something barely audible. Ethan leaned closer, catching broken words between shallow breaths. He slipped there. I heard someone. Daniel frowned. Heard someone? Caleb's eyelids fluttered. A voice. Down below. The words sent a subtle chill through Ethan's spine. Daniel exchanged a glance with him. The storm had been violent the previous night. If the ridge had collapsed in more than one place, someone else could be trapped. It was unlikely, but not impossible. Daniel hesitated only a moment before speaking into his radio again, requesting confirmation from dispatch about any other missing persons reported in the area. None so far. Ethan shifted Caleb carefully into Daniel's support. Get him down, Ethan said quietly. Daniel studied him. You don't know there's anyone else? I don't, Ethan replied. But if there is... He did not finish the sentence. Shadow stood rigid again, ears forward, nostrils flaring. The old dog's body trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the strain of standing so long on unstable ground. Yet his eyes remained sharp. The ridge above the observation station sloped toward a deeper ravine rarely explored even in better weather. Rain had carved fresh channels through loose dirt, exposing sharp stone edges beneath. The soil was unstable, slick underfoot. Ethan moved slowly, testing each foothold before shifting weight. The scar in his thigh throbbed fiercely with each climb, a dull heat spreading through muscle and bone. He ignored it as best he could. Halfway toward the narrow drop-off, the sky opened again. Rain fell suddenly and hard, turning the rock face into a dark, glistening surface. Daniel had not followed this time. He was escorting Caleb down safely. Ethan and Shadow were alone near the upper edge. Easy, Ethan murmured, more to himself than to the dog. The ground gave way without warning. A section of wet soil collapsed beneath Ethan's right boot. His body pitched sideways toward a narrow fissure splitting the rock face. He grabbed instinctively at a protruding branch, but felt it snap under his weight. For a brief, terrifying second, he felt the same helpless drop he had known years earlier overseas. Then tension jerked sharply at his waist. Shadow had lunged backward, teeth clenched onto the strap of Ethan's utility rope that he had looped around himself earlier for safety. The dog's paws dug into the mud. His aging muscles strained visibly. His hind legs slid several inches before catching on a jagged stone. Ethan's body dangled partially over the fissure, boots scraping against slick rock. "Hold," Ethan whispered hoarsely. Shadow growled low, not in aggression but in effort. Every line of his body trembled. The rain pounded against his back, flattening silvered fur. His eyes never broke from Ethan's. With careful motion, Ethan shifted one hand onto a stable rock edge. He pulled upward slowly, using his core strength rather than his injured leg. The rope tightened again, and Shadow braced harder. After agonizing seconds, Ethan regained enough footing to climb fully back onto solid ground. He dropped to his knees, breathing hard. Shadow released the strap only once Ethan was upright. For a moment, they simply stood there, rain soaking them both. Ethan pressed his forehead briefly against Shadow's head, the gesture instinctive and wordless. Then they heard it. A faint, muffled sound rising from below the fissure. Not wind, not shifting stone. A voice. Ethan froze, heart hammering. He crouched at the edge carefully, peering down into the narrow crevice carved by erosion and collapse. About 15 feet below, wedged between broken slabs of rock, was a small figure. Not Caleb, another child, A girl, perhaps 8 years old, wearing a red rain jacket now streaked with mud. Her dark hair clung to her cheeks. One arm shielded her head from falling debris. Her other hand grasped at nothing. She looked up weakly. "Help," she whispered. Ethan's breath caught sharply. The ravine opened directly beneath the section of ridge where Nolan had fallen years ago. The memory struck him with sudden clarity. The same angle of rock, the same unstable slope. For a moment, time blurred again. Shadow barked once, sharp and focused. Ethan forced himself back into the present. "I see you," he called down, voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "Stay still." He secured the rope more tightly around his waist and anchored the opposite end around a thick tree root protruding from the rock face. He tested it twice. Shadow moved to the edge and lay down flat, positioning his body across the anchor point instinctively, adding weight despite the strain. Ethan began to lower himself carefully into the fissure, boots searching for footholds. Rain continued to pour, turning the descent into a slick challenge. The walls were narrow, forcing him to twist sideways at points. Loose gravel fell past him, striking the rocks below. The girl's breathing was shallow. As he reached her level, he saw a thin cut across her forehead and bruising along her shoulder. "What's your name?" he asked calmly. "Emily," she answered weakly. "Emily, I'm going to get you out. Can you move your legs?" She nodded slightly. I slipped, looking for Caleb. The realization settled quickly. She must have followed the same trail earlier. Ethan maneuvered himself into a position where he could lift her without destabilizing the rocks further. His injured leg protested sharply as he shifted weight, but adrenaline overrode the pain. He secured the rope around Emily's small frame first, ensuring she would be lifted before him. "When I say hold on, you wrap your arms around my neck, don't let go." Above, Shadow remained unmoving, body pressed firm against the anchor point. Rain streamed down his muzzle. His chest rose and fell heavily, but his eyes never wavered. "Now," Ethan said. Emily clung to him weakly. Ethan signaled upward by tugging twice on the rope. Using careful leverage, he began to climb while guiding her body upward with his own. The rope tightened gradually, tension transferring through the anchor where Shadow braced. The ascent felt longer than it was. Rocks shifted slightly but held. Ethan's arms burned, his legs screamed with pain. He focused only on controlled motion, step, grip, lift. At the edge, Shadow stood and leaned backward instinctively as Emily's small form came into reach. Ethan pushed her upward first. Shadow moved aside just enough for her to roll safely onto the surface. Moments later, Ethan pulled himself up fully, collapsing briefly onto wet stone beside her. Emily coughed once but remained conscious. Shadow stepped forward and gently nudged her shoulder, sniffing to confirm she was stable. The dog then lowered himself heavily onto the ground, sides heaving with effort. Daniel's voice echoed faintly from below, calling up toward them. Backup had arrived. Ethan lay there for a second longer, staring at the gray sky. The ridge beneath him was the same place he had avoided for years, the same terrain where Nolan had fallen beyond reach. But this time, he had descended willingly. This time, he had not turned back. He looked at Shadow. The old German shepherd's muzzle was streaked with rain and mud, eyes bright despite exhaustion. He had held the line again, not as swiftly as in youth, not with the same effortless strength, but with the same decision. As rescuers climbed toward them and secured Emily for descent, Ethan rose slowly to his feet. The observation station loomed in the background, silent witness to both past and present. He had returned to the place he once feared, and this time he had reached the one who was falling. The storm finally broke apart into drifting gray clouds by late afternoon, leaving the ridge washed in pale light. Emergency crews moved carefully along the slick trail, guiding Emily and Caleb down toward waiting ambulances. Sheriff Daniel Reeves coordinated with firm clarity, his voice steady over the radio as he updated dispatch. Laura Bennett stood near the base of the slope, clutching Caleb once he was brought down, her slender frame shaking not from weakness, but from the release of fear she had held too tightly for too long. Emily's father arrived shortly after, a wiry man named Thomas Green with sharp cheekbones and deep-set hazel eyes, his dark hair streaked prematurely with gray. He had driven in from the neighboring town after hearing of the search, his face etched with guilt for not knowing his daughter had followed Caleb up the ridge. He thanked Ethan repeatedly, voice cracking despite his attempt to appear composed. Up near the observation station, Ethan remained seated on a flat stone, catching his breath. His injured leg trembled slightly beneath him, pain radiating up from the old scar reopened by strain. Shadow lay beside him, sides rising and falling with labored rhythm. Mud streaked the dog's silvered muzzle. His once powerful frame looked smaller now, as if the years had finally revealed themselves without disguise. Deputy Mark Ellis approached cautiously. "Sir," he said to Ethan, still addressing him with formal respect, "you should probably get that leg looked at." Mark's dark eyes held genuine concern. He had witnessed the near fall earlier and understood how narrowly disaster had been avoided. "I'm fine," Ethan replied quietly, though the word did not fully convince either of them. As rescue crews finished their checks, Daniel climbed back up briefly to ensure nothing else was unstable. He paused when he saw Shadow stirring near a patch of disturbed earth just beyond the fissure where Emily had been trapped. The dog rose slowly, sniffing intently at the base of a partially collapsed stone ledge. His posture shifted, not alarmed, but focused. He began to dig. At first, Ethan assumed it was residual instinct, leftover adrenaline driving aimless motion, but Shadow persisted. His paws scraped at the wet soil with determination, ignoring the ache in his joints. Small stones rolled aside. Mud splattered his legs. "What's he doing?" Mark asked quietly. Ethan watched closely. "He smells something." Daniel stepped nearer. "This ridge was used for training years ago," he said thoughtfully. "Could be old equipment buried." Shadow dug deeper, exposing a corner of metal. The edge was rusted but solid. Ethan moved forward and knelt, ignoring the sharp protest from his leg. Together, he and Daniel cleared the soil enough to reveal a small, military-issued container wedged between stones. Its latch was corroded, but intact. Ethan's pulse quickened unexpectedly. He recognized the design immediately. He had not seen one like it in years. With careful effort, he pried it open. Inside lay a worn military identification tag and a sealed envelope protected in plastic. The name on the tag read, "Nolan Brooks." The air seemed to thin. Daniel stepped back slightly, sensing something deeply personal unfolding. Ethan's hands trembled, not violently but subtly, as though old memories were rising through muscle and bone. He removed the envelope. The plastic was stiff from age, edges cracked but still sealed enough to preserve what lay inside. He hesitated only briefly before opening it. The paper within was faded but legible. The handwriting was Nolan's, slanted slightly to the right, hurried but earnest. Ethan read silently at first, lips barely moving. "If you're reading this, it means they found you." The letter began, "I saw you come back. I saw you try." Ethan's breath caught. Daniel glanced toward him but did not interrupt. "It all went down too fast." The letter continued. "The ground gave way. I knew you couldn't reach me. You were there. I remember that. Don't carry something that isn't yours. You didn't leave me. The ridge did." Ethan lowered the paper slightly, eyes fixed on the words as if they might disappear. "I was scared," Nolan had written, "but not because of you. If I don't make it, don't let it freeze you. You're the kind who moves forward. That's why I followed you." The letter ended simply. "Go home. Live." The wind shifted gently across the ridge. For years, Ethan had replayed that night in fragments, convinced that he had not done enough, that perhaps one more step, one more second, could have changed the outcome. He had never known Nolan saw him return. He had never known that the effort had been witnessed and understood. The guilt he carried had not been based on fact, but on silence. Now that silence was broken. Ethan's shoulders sagged. He did not weep loudly. He did not collapse dramatically. Instead, he bowed his head, pressing his forehead briefly against the cold metal container. A long breath left him, deeper than any he had taken in years. Shadow moved closer and rested his chin against Ethan's knee. It was the same gesture the dog had made overseas when anchoring him to consciousness. Daniel spoke softly. "He knew." Ethan nodded slowly. "Yeah." Down below, word of the rescue had already begun spreading through Brookidge. News traveled quickly in towns that still relied on conversation more than headlines. By the time Ethan and Daniel descended with the recovered items secured, a small crowd had gathered near the trailhead. Neighbors, store owners, families. Laura Bennett stood near the front, holding Caleb wrapped in a blanket. Emily sat beside her father, clutching his jacket sleeve. When they saw Shadow emerging from the trees, mud-streaked but upright, a ripple moved through the crowd. Murmurs shifted into applause, not loud or celebratory, but steady and sincere. Tom Miller pushed forward, red-cheeked and emotional. "That dog led them right to the kids," he announced to anyone within earshot, pride swelling his voice as if Shadow belonged to all of them. Deputy Mark confirmed it openly. "We wouldn't have found that second Fisher without him." Sheriff Reeves stepped forward, resting a hand briefly on Shadow's back. "This wasn't luck," he said firmly. "This was training, instinct, and loyalty." Laura approached Ethan, eyes filled with gratitude that bordered on disbelief. "Thank you," she said, voice trembling. "Both of you." Ethan only nodded. Over the following days, the story traveled beyond Brookidge. A small article appeared in the county paper, featuring a photograph of Shadow standing beside Ethan near the ridge. His silvered muzzle lifted proudly, despite visible fatigue. The headline called him a hero. A week later, the town council organized a modest gathering in the park. There were no grand banners, no dramatic speeches, just folding chairs set beneath oak trees and neighbors standing close together. Mayor Harold Whitman, a tall, thin man in his late 50s with rimless glasses and a careful, diplomatic manner, read a short statement recognizing the courage displayed during the rescue. He was a man who believed in quiet acknowledgement rather than spectacle. His own brother had once been a volunteer firefighter, lost in a house collapse decades earlier, and that loss had shaped his belief in honoring service without exaggeration. At the center of the gathering stood a simple wooden plaque mounted on a post. Carved into it were the words, "Shadow, the silent hero." Applause rose gently across the park. Shadow stood beside Ethan, posture dignified though his breathing remained heavy. Children approached cautiously, offering tentative pats along his back. He accepted them calmly, tail giving a slow, tired wag. Ethan watched all of it without stepping forward into the spotlight. The truth Nolan had left behind had loosened something inside him. The ridge no longer felt like unfinished business. It felt like closure. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Ethan knelt beside Shadow. "You've been carrying more than I knew," he murmured. The dog blinked, amber eyes steady. He had not only saved lives, he had restored one. The rain returned weeks later, softer than the storm on the ridge, but steady enough to blur the windows of Ethan's small house at the edge of Brookidge. Autumn had deepened into early winter. The air outside carried a sharper bite, and Ethan now wore his green and black plaid flannel jacket over a thermal shirt, the fabric thicker against the cold. The plaque in the park still stood firm, weathered slightly already by wind and dew, but Shadow no longer walked beneath it. That evening, the house felt unusually quiet. Shadow had been slower in recent days. After the rescue, exhaustion had settled into his bones, as if the effort had drawn the last of his stored strength forward. His breathing had grown heavier at night. Sometimes he struggled to stand without Ethan's hand beneath his ribs. The silver in his muzzle seemed brighter in dim light, his once powerful shoulders now visibly thinner beneath his coat. Ethan had noticed every change. He had begun sleeping on the floor beside Shadow instead of in his bed. He placed an extra blanket beneath the dog to cushion aging joints. He warmed water before setting it down, making sure the temperature was gentle. He spoke more now, not in commands, but in quiet conversation, recounting small memories as if they were shared possessions. On this particular night, the rain tapped softly against the roof. The fire in the small iron stove cast a low orange glow across the room. Ethan sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, Shadow's head resting across his thigh. The dog's amber eyes were open but distant, following the flicker of firelight without fully focusing. "You remember that first patrol?" Ethan murmured, fingers brushing slowly through thinning fur. "You blocked me like you owned the road." Shadow's ears twitched faintly at the sound of his voice. Ethan swallowed, the weight of unspoken years pressing at his chest. "You never let me carry it alone," he said quietly. Shadow exhaled, a long, soft breath. The rain intensified slightly outside, drumming in a rhythm that once would have sent Ethan's mind spiraling back to gunfire and chaos. Tonight, it felt different. It felt like a curtain closing gently. Shadow shifted once, trying to lift his head higher. Ethan immediately supported him, sliding closer, wrapping one arm beneath the dog's neck. The fur beneath his fingers felt warmer than usual, but the pulse beneath it was slower. "I'm right here," Ethan whispered. There was no dramatic moment, no sudden cry, just a gradual stillness that crept into the space between breaths. Shadow's eyes, still open, softened. His chest rose once more, then settled. Ethan knew before the silence fully formed. His body tightened instinctively, as if bracing for impact. For years he had controlled his reactions to loss. kept them internal, quiet, disciplined. He had learned to swallow grief before it surfaced. This time he did not. He pulled Shadow fully into his arms, pressing his forehead against the dog's silvered muzzle. His shoulders shook as sobs broke free without restraint. The sound was raw, unfiltered, filling the small house with something that had waited decades to be heard. He spoke through tears, words stumbling over one another. "You stayed," he choked. "You stayed every time." His fingers trembled against fur that no longer moved. "Thank you," he whispered again and again, voice cracking, as if the repetition might bridge whatever distance had just opened. Outside, the rain continued without interruption. Inside, Ethan let himself grieve fully for the first time in his life. The following days blurred together. Sheriff Daniel Reeves stopped by quietly, removing his hat at the door when he stepped inside. Laura Bennett brought a small casserole, her pale face gentler now, her gratitude unchanged. Even Tom Miller arrived awkwardly with a box of tools he insisted Ethan might need for something. No one stayed long. They understood the kind of solitude that follows deep loss. Ethan buried Shadow at the edge of his property beneath a tall pine tree that overlooked the forest line. The ground was cold, but not yet frozen solid. He dug the grave himself, despite the ache in his leg and the fatigue in his arms. He wrapped Shadow in the thick blanket they had shared for weeks and lowered him carefully, hands steady despite the tremor in his breath. He did not speak long at the graveside. Words felt unnecessary. Winter arrived in earnest after that. Snow blanketed Brookidge, muting color and sound alike. Ethan continued taking small jobs, though he moved more slowly. The house felt larger now, too quiet. For weeks he rose each morning instinctively expecting the familiar weight of Shadow's presence at his side. The absence struck fresh each time. But something else began to surface gradually. Without Shadow to care for, Ethan noticed other dogs differently. Strays that wandered near the outskirts of town. Abandoned animals dropped near the forest when families could not afford to keep them. He began leaving food at the edge of his yard, then water bowls, then an old insulated shed cleaned and repaired. One afternoon in early spring, a woman named Sarah Collins knocked at his door. She was in her early 30s, tall and slim with chestnut brown hair cut just above her shoulders. Her skin was fair, cheeks flushed from wind. She worked as a volunteer coordinator at the county animal shelter. Years earlier, she had adopted a rescue dog that passed from illness too soon, and the loss had drawn her deeper into animal care rather than away from it. Her eyes held both empathy and determination. "I heard you've been helping strays," she said gently, glancing at the makeshift shelter in Ethan's yard, where two mixed-breed dogs now slept. "I'm not running anything official," Ethan replied. Sarah smiled softly. Sometimes the best things aren't official. Over the next weeks, she returned occasionally with supplies, vaccinations, basic training guidance, food donations. Ethan resisted at first the idea that he was building something, but slowly, quietly, his yard transformed into a refuge. He repaired fencing, reinforced the shed, installed proper bedding. The town began bringing him dogs that needed temporary homes. Ethan did not replace Shadow. He extended him. Months later, on a mild afternoon as snow finally melted from the edges of the forest, a small truck pulled into his yard. Sarah stepped out, holding a bundled shape in her arms. "This one came in yesterday," she said quietly. She unfolded the blanket to reveal a young German shepherd pup, perhaps 4 months old. His coat was black and tan, the saddle dark and rich, legs sturdy but still slightly oversized for his frame. His ears were not fully upright yet, one tilting sideways uncertainly. His amber-brown eyes were wide and alert, filled with cautious curiosity rather than fear. He was left near the highway, Sarah added softly. No tag, no chip. Ethan crouched slowly. The pup studied him carefully before stepping forward, placing one tentative paw onto Ethan's knee. The color of his eyes struck something deep, not identical, not a mirror, but close enough to stir memory. Ethan felt the ache rise, but it was different now. It did not hollow him. It warmed him. He reached out, resting his hand gently atop the pup's head. The young dog did not flinch. He leaned into the touch. Ethan allowed himself a small smile, soft, unguarded. It was not that he believed Shadow had returned. It was that he understood something at last. Love does not vanish when a body stills. It settles into what you build next. As the wind moved gently through the trees and the new pup explored the yard that had once echoed with an older, heavier gait, Ethan stood and watched. Shadow had never truly left. He remained in every life Ethan chose to lift. And in that quiet understanding, Ethan finally felt at peace. Ethan once believed survival was something a man earned alone. War had taught him discipline. Loss had taught him silence. But Shadow taught him something deeper, that love is not measured by how long it lasts, but by how fully it shows up. Through gunfire, through rain, through years of quiet struggle, that old German shepherd never walked away. And when the time came for goodbye, Ethan finally understood that the greatest courage is not in facing danger, but in allowing yourself to feel. He lost a friend, but he gained a truth. You will never have enough time with the ones who truly matter. Not with a loyal dog, not with a parent, not with a child. Time does not slow for love, but you always have a choice. You can notice them. Sit beside them. Walk a little slower. Speak the words you are saving for later, because later is never promised. So treasure them while they are still here.